You're sitting at your kitchen table, doing nothing unusual, and your dog is just staring at you, not blinking, not moving, just locked onto your face with a quiet, steady gaze that doesn't break. Most people assume it's hunger or they need a walk or they're just being a little clingy. But behavioral neuroscience tells a completely different story. That stare has almost nothing to do with any of that. What your dog is doing right now is one of the most complex emotional signals that exists between two species. And what they're saying to you, in that silence, with those eyes, you need to hear it. So why is your dog staring at you right now? The obvious answers feel right at first. They're hungry. They want attention. They're bored, and you happen to be the most interesting thing in the room. And sometimes those things are true. A dog will absolutely stare at you if their bowl has been empty for 20 minutes. But that's a different kind of stare. You can feel the difference, even if you've never put words to it. The hunger stare comes with movement. A tail that swings low, a body that shifts and paces, a nose that nudges your hand. The stare we're talking about is still, quiet, just eyes, locked onto your face, holding without asking for anything obvious. That stare has been showing up in behavioral research for over a decade. And what scientists have found keeps rewriting what we thought we understood about this relationship. In 2015, a team at Asabu University in Japan published a study in the journal Science. They brought dog owner pairs into a lab and measured their oxytocin levels before and after sustained mutual eye contact. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. It's the same chemical that floods a mother's brain when she looks at her newborn for the very first time. It is the neurochemical foundation of love, trust, and deep long-term attachment between living creatures. What the researchers found stopped the scientific community cold. When a dog and their owner made eye contact, real, held, mutual eye contact, both of their oxytocin levels rose. Not just the humans, not just the dogs, both. At the same time, a shared gaze between two different species triggering the same hormonal cascade as a parent bonding with their child. This had never been documented anywhere in the scientific literature before. Not once. The team then tested wolves raised by humans from birth. Animals just as socialized, just as comfortable with human presence, just as familiar with touch and routine. When those wolves made eye contact with their human handlers, oxytocin didn't move. Nothing happened. That single result is one of the most important findings in modern animal behavior science. Because it means this isn't about familiarity. It isn't about training or conditioning. It is specific to dogs. Somewhere along their evolutionary path, dogs didn't just learn to tolerate eye contact with humans. They developed a biological mechanism that uses eye contact to create genuine chemical bonding, the same process humans use with each other. And it runs in both directions. Your dog looks at you and experiences the same hormonal surge you do. So the next time your dog holds your gaze and you feel something, warmth, connection, a quiet pull you can't quite explain, don't dismiss it. That's not sentiment. That's two nervous systems recognizing each other in real time. Your dog isn't staring at you. They're bonding with you, but not every stare means the same thing. And this is where most owners get it wrong. There isn't one universal dog stare. There are several. And learning to read the difference isn't just interesting, it can actually change how you respond to your dog and how they feel around you. The first is the soft gaze. This is the one we've been talking about. Relaxed muscles around the eyes, a slightly drooping lid, no tension in the brow or jaw. The body will usually match, loose, low, calm. Sometimes the tail moves slowly. Sometimes the dog is completely still. This gaze means one thing. I trust you. You are safe. I am safe with you. When your dog looks at you this way, they are not processing a threat. They are not waiting for command. They are simply choosing to be present with you because your presence is where they want to be. The second is the hard stare. This one looks different the moment you know what to look for. The eyes become rigid. The brow pushes forward. The body tightens, weight shifted slightly forward, stillness that feels loaded rather than relaxed. This is not a bonding signal. This is communication of a different kind, a warning, a challenge, or extreme discomfort. If you see this stare, especially directed at a stranger or another animal, the best response is to redirect calmly, not to match it. The third is whale eye. You'll know it when you see it. The head turns slightly but the eyes stay fixed on you, and you can see the whites of their eyes at the edges, like a crescent at the corners. This means your dog is stressed, overwhelmed, possibly trapped in a situation they don't know how to leave. It often happens during hugging, being held, or crowded environments they didn't choose. Many people misread this as the dog being weird or dramatic. It isn't. It's them asking, quietly but clearly, for a little more space. The fourth is the slow blink. Your dog looks at you, holds the gaze, and then blinks once, slowly, deliberately, sometimes followed by looking away briefly before returning. This is one of the softest things a dog can do. In behavioral science, it's associated with relaxation, safety, and affection. Your dog is telling you that they are completely at ease, that they don't need to stay alert around you, that they can close their eyes near you and still feel safe. Here is where it gets interesting, though. Researchers have found that humans often unintentionally make sustained, unblinking eye contact back at their dogs, the way you might stare at your phone or hold a gaze in conversation. To a dog that doesn't know you well, a hard, unblinking stare from a human reads as pressure, as challenge, as something to be cautious about. Many owners have accidentally made their dogs anxious this way, without ever knowing it. The fix is simple. Blink. Soften your eyes. Look away briefly and look back. Let your face say what your dog's face says to you every day. Because communication only works when both sides are speaking the same language. When did dogs first learn to look into human eyes? The short answer is, they didn't learn it. They evolved it. Slowly, over thousands of years, through a process that selected for exactly this ability, because the dogs that could connect with humans through eye contact were the ones that survived. 15,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern dogs began living near human settlements. Not because they were invited, because humans produced waste, and waste attracted prey, and prey attracted wolves. But something happened during that long period of proximity that changed the dog's biology in ways we are still discovering. One of the most striking findings came from a 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Researchers compared the facial muscles of modern dogs with those of wolves. They found that dogs had developed a muscle that wolves simply don't have. It's called the levator anguli oculi medialis, a small muscle in the inner brow that, when contracted, raises the inner corner of the eyebrow. This single muscle creates the look that every dog owner recognizes instantly. That tilted, slightly raised brow that makes a dog's face look sad, soft, and completely focused on you. Wolves don't make this expression. They can't. They don't have the muscle. But here's the part that changes everything. This muscle wasn't something dogs were born with from the beginning. It appeared in the domestic dog population over generations of living with humans, and researchers believe it was selected for because it triggered a powerful response in us. When a dog raises that inner brow, it mimics an expression that humans find deeply compelling, one associated with vulnerability, connection, and emotional openness. In other words, the dogs that could make that face got more food, more protection, more care. Their offspring survived in greater numbers. That expression became encoded into the species. The stare your dog gives you right now, that soft, focused, slightly heartbreaking look, is not random behavior. It is 15,000 years of evolution building a bridge between two species, one glance at a time. And what makes dogs uniquely capable of this goes deeper than muscles. Studies comparing dogs and wolves raised identically in human environments consistently show one thing. Dogs look to human faces for information in a way that wolves never do. When presented with an unsolvable puzzle, wolves keep trying on their own. Dogs look at the person in the room. They check your face. They read your expression. They are watching you constantly for signals about what the world means. That orientation, that instinct to look at a human face as a source of truth, is not trained. It is biological. It is in them at birth. Your dog looks into your eyes because their species built that behavior over millennia of learning that your face contains the answers to the questions that matter most to them. Where is it safe? What is coming? Whether you are okay. The stare was never random. It was designed for you to bring it all together. When your dog sits across the room and locks their eyes onto yours, they are doing three things at the same time, and none of them are accidental. First, they're triggering an oxytocin loop in both of your bodies. A mutual hormonal response that deepens attachment and builds trust with every shared gaze. This loop doesn't just make you feel closer to your dog in the moment. Research shows it compounds over time, each bonding interaction making the next one stronger, deepening a connection that builds across years. Second, they are reading you. Dogs are extraordinary at extracting emotional information from human faces, better, in fact, than chimpanzees, who share 99% of our DNA. Your dog is watching your eyes to understand your mood, your intention, and your state of mind. They're monitoring you, quietly and constantly, the way only a creature deeply invested in your well-being would bother to do. They know when you're sad before you say a word. They know when you're tense before you move. They know when something is wrong because they have been studying your face every day for their entire life. Third, they are expressing something they have no other way to say out loud. I chose you, not just because you feed me or walk me or open the door. Because in whatever way a dog understands safety and love and home, you are it. Now, there's one more thing I want to tell you, because it matters more than the rest. If your dog used to hold your gaze and has slowly started looking away more than usual, if they avoid eye contact, turn their head when you try to connect, or stare at empty corners instead of your face, pay attention. In older dogs, that shift can be an early sign of cognitive dysfunction. In dogs of any age, persistent gaze aversion can signal chronic pain, anxiety, or a breakdown in the trust they have with the people around them. The presence of a stare is a gift, but the absence of it is information too. And just as your dog watches your face every day to understand how you're doing, you can watch theirs to understand exactly the same. The next time your dog finds you in a room and locks their eyes onto yours, at the kitchen table, lying across the couch, right before they fall asleep beside you, you know exactly what you're looking at now. 15,000 years of evolution. A muscle that grew in their face just to reach yours. An oxytocin loop between two species that science only recently learned to measure. They chose you. And every time they stare at you, they're making that choice again. If this changed how you see that look, subscribe to this channel. We go this deep every single week. Drop a comment below. I want to know, what does your dog do when they stare at you? Do they hold it for a long time, or do they look away first? Because next, we're going to talk about what happens when your dog turns their back to you while they sleep, and the science behind why they position themselves that way is even stranger than you'd expect.